Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be with everyone. Excited today to talk a little bit about grit, passion, and perseverance for long-term goals. I really got interested in this topic because I have often wondered what makes some people successful in the face of adversity and others not successful. And so I started looking into different psychological measures, and I found grit. Now, the first thing I learned about grit was was a study that happened a few years ago at the West Point Academy. Now, at West Point, cadets are put through a very interesting introductory training program that they affectionately call Beast Barracks. Now, Beast Barracks consists of academic coursework that is very rigorous, in addition to physical activity and training that is very rigorous also. And so not only are you having to go to school as a West Point cadet, but you're also having to go through a training program that requires lots and lots of physical activity. Now, as you can imagine, Beast Barracks is used by and large not only as an onboarding process for cadets at West Point, but also as something that can screen out people who aren't really ready to make it through the rest of the West Point traditional training. So the Army has developed a bunch of measures to try to predict who will make it through Beast Barracks and who won't. They have something called the whole candidate score that is a number of different measures put together, including GPA, psychological measures, and it is fairly decent at predicting who will make it through Beast Barracks. But there is something else that is actually more predictive, and that's grit. Now, Angela Duckworth, which we'll talk about in a minute, developed grit, and she did a study with her colleagues to study West Point cadets and see if grit, passion, and perseverance for long-term goals is more predictive than the whole candidate score. And what they found is that yes, indeed, people who scored higher on the grit test were more likely to make it through Beast Barracks, and it was more predictive than the whole candidate score that the Army had developed. Now, when I heard this story, I got very interested because this is an already sort of tough bunch of people, West Point cadets, and now you have this psychological or psychometric measure, grit, that is being even more predictive than something that the Army spent lots of money developing, the whole candidate score, more predictive than the whole candidate score, and predicting who would make it through this very tough training process. So I wanted to know more. Now, let me first back up and say, why should we even care about this notion of grit? You may have heard about it in the news. It's very popular. Like I mentioned, Angela Duckworth came up with this concept. But there's several studies that have shown that grit is highly predictive of success in different areas. We already talked about the West Point Cadet Training Program. Also, grit has been shown in numerous studies to predict higher GPAs amongst undergraduates. So those who scored higher in grit also had higher GPAs. Amongst adults, we have found that those that score higher in grit had a correlation with higher educational attainment. Also, this is an interesting one, progress in the Scripps Spelling Bee. So this large national spelling bee that we have every year, grit predicted who would go further in the spelling bee, so who would make it further into the spelling bee. And I also got so interested in this topic that I ended up writing my doctoral dissertation and a research article on this topic of grit in education, and found that there's a correlation between doctoral student GPAs and grit scores. So there's lots of reasons why we should care about grit. And in general, all of these different studies are pointing to the fact that it's a predictive measure of who can persevere towards a long-term goal and make it through adversity. So as I mentioned, Dr. Angela Duckworth, who is at the Wharton School and the University of Pennsylvania, she's a psychology professor, came up with the construct of grit. And I want to explain a little bit about what grit is, and then we'll continue on to discuss how you might actually develop grit, how you might improve grit, which is sort of the holy grail right now in psychology and organizational studies, of how you might improve through personal development or other means this attribute of grit. So first, what is grit? Well, really, like I've mentioned, it's perseverance and passion for long-term goals, and it is predictive. It's a trait level construct. It is not IQ. So it's not, if you look at number two on your screen, in the 1940s, there was a researcher named Terman, and he was famous for his terminites. These were his subjects he was studying over a longitudinal study, and he thought that, look, if I could figure out who has of these students have a higher IQ, I will be able to predict who is going to be successful later on in life. And so he ran a large longitudinal study for many years, and he was using IQ to try to predict who would have life success. And in some ways this was true, but in most ways it wasn't. And he actually concluded, and it says here on in the yellow box, suggested that non-cognitive or particular personality traits may be more important than IQ in predicting future success. So grit isn't IQ. It doesn't mean that people who have a lot of grit aren't smart, but that IQ and grit are not the same thing. Third, yes, grit is achievement oriented, but look at this quote here. The gritty individual approaches achievement as a marathon. His or her advantage is stamina. So it's not just chasing after one quick win after another. It's having stamina to go after the long-term meaningful goals. Four, it's not exactly persistence, though it includes persistence and perseverance. Grit is a non-cognitive measure of one's ability to persevere in pursuit of that long-term goal without desisting or changing interests along the way. And number five, grit entails the capacity to sustain effort and interest in projects that take months or years. So we're not just talking about a long-term goal in terms of next week. Long-term goal is defined as months or even years to accomplish. Now, quickly, let me run through a few of these differences, because lots of people will say, look, grit really isn't that new because we already knew about self-control or conscientiousness, which is one of the big five personality traits, or achievement orientation. And while those things are similar, as I mentioned, they're not exactly the same. So let's talk a little bit about achievement orientation. This is a great quote from Duckworth. She says, grit overlaps with achievement, the achievement aspects of conscientiousness, but differs in its emphasis on long-term stamina rather than short-term intensity. So think about this. Grit is a little bit different than conscientiousness and achievement because it's not focused on the short-term intensity it would take to achieve something now or to delay gratification, which we'll talk about in a minute, but is more steady over time. And I like to just call this gritty. You're more gritty and steady over time. You have more passion and perseverance over a long period of time to be able to reach a long-term goal. Now, what this is saying is that, yes, there might be short bursts of intensity towards these goals. As we know, achieving anything in life is often not linear. It's ups and downs towards a long-term strategy. But what it is saying is that there's a more measured approach to attaining a long-term goal that gritty individuals have. Now, I put together this slide because in the upper left, I wanted you to think about this long road. So grit is a long road. If you're gritty, you are going after these long-term goals. Or maybe, for example, you're setting a fitness goal that takes a long time. And so that would be an example of someone who is gritty. But it's not what is below. So I put marshmallows in the candy, and this is to remind me of a study that Walter Mischel did at Stanford a number of years ago called the marshmallow test. Many of you have heard of this. This is a study where Dr. Mischel put a marshmallow in front of a young child and said, you can either eat this marshmallow now, or if you wait until I come back in a little bit, we'll give you 2 marshmallows. So all the child had to do was wait a little bit longer and not eat the marshmallow, and they would get a second one. Now, many individuals just ate the marshmallow and just ignored the directions, and they didn't get a second marshmallow. but many others actually were able to find ways to distract themselves in order to not eat the marshmallow and gained a second marshmallow. And you can look up the videos on YouTube on this, and they're quite funny because you will see children who are smelling the marshmallow, some who even are tasting the marshmallow but not eating it and putting it back. Some will distract themselves by turning away or looking at something else, counting, singing, all kinds of different distractions to keep themselves from eating the marshmallow. Now, what Walter Mischel found is that those children who did not eat the original marshmallow and gained the second marshmallow were able to control their impulses. And later on in life, as they followed through a longitudinal study, followed these children, were more successful. And so what they concluded is that delayed gratification, if you have the ability to delay your gratification through impulse control, can lead to further success in the future. Now, this seems obvious, but it's not really the same thing as grit. Why? Because the individual who is gritty is able to persist over a long period of time. So listen to this quote. An individual high in self-control, but moderate in grit, may, for example, effectively control his or her temper, stick to his or her diet, and resist the urge to surf the internet at work, yet switch careers annually. So think about this. This is a difference between grit and this idea of delayed gratification and self-control. We may be able to stick with our diet, right, for a short period of time, or we may be able to distract ourselves in the short term to be able to control our temper, but we might be changing interests over time, for example, switching careers. Now, this doesn't say switching jobs, this says switching careers. So think about a friend that you might have that has moved from, they wanted to be an artist and then they wanted to be a lawyer, and then they decided that later they wanted to be a nurse, right? So they're changing complete career interests. What gritty individuals are able to do is sustain interest over time. Now, the real question is, how do we actually build grit? And this is sort of the million-dollar question right now. And Angela Duckworth suggests in her new book on grit that there are 4 ways to actually build grit, and we'll talk about those now. The first is that you got to have interest in something. We've discussed that. You must deliberately practice in the area of your interest. It also must be coupled with purpose, and last, with hope. So, interest. Kind of obvious. If you're going to go after a long-term goal, you have to sustain interest in whatever you're going after. Now, this doesn't mean that sometimes, for example, if your long-term goal is to learn how to play the banjo, that you don't have times where you don't really want to learn banjo anymore, or you put away the guitar or the banjo, or if you're learning a different language or going to school, that there isn't ups and downs. There's certainly ups and downs. The question is that does this topic hold your interest over time, or does it keep reoccurring that it's a topic that you're interested in over long periods of time? If it's not, then you're going to have a hard time sustaining grit towards your long-term goal. So we need to find something we're interested in. And frankly, I'll add here, you need to be somewhat good at it to sustain your interest. There's lots of studies on flow, for example, the psychological state of losing yourself or being in the zone. If you've ever played sports, you might feel like you're in the zone and time stops and you lose track of yourself. That's when something is sufficiently difficult but interesting to you that you become completely engrossed in the activity. Usually that means that it's difficult enough to challenge you, but not so difficult that it makes you desist. In other words, you're good enough at it to continue to improve and gain feedback that you're getting better, but not so hard or you're not good at that thing so much that you desist because you're making no progress. So interest and ability need to be considered, and you need to find something that you're interested in. So that's the first evaluation of how do you increase grit is, am I really interested in this? Do I have some skill in it? And is there a mechanism for feedback along the way that I can see my progress? Next is deliberate practice or practice. Many of you will remember Malcolm Gladwell's famous book Outliers that talks about why some people are really successful and others not. And he describes the 10,000 hour rule. Now, Duckworth quotes here and says, sometimes this rule is called the 10-year rule, so called because the average number of hours of effortful practice was 10,000 hours over 10 years. So what Gladwell argues is that for anyone to become an expert in anything, you need to have spent 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, which often equates to about 10 years, before you become an expert. Now, this he found in professional violin players and other types of professionals, even in professional workplace environments. And so what we need to think about in terms of persisting after a long-term goal is first realizing, yes, we have to have interest, and second, that it's going to take a lot of practice. And that's okay. You're not immediately going to be great at it, but it's a different type of practice. It's deliberate practice. It's practice that is very effortful and very regular. Now, one thing to keep in mind within the realm of practice is something called growth mindset. And this is a mindset ability. It's not ability, actually. It's a mindset construct, a way that we approach long-term goals in practice that can help us be more successful in our practice. So Carol Dweck sort of is the guru of growth mindset. And she says, did I win? Did I lose? Those are the wrong questions. The correct question is, did I make my best effort? Now, Dweck has studied children and what makes some of them persist in, for example, doing math problems or learning other types of different tasks, and has found that if children have a growth mindset, they are more likely to be successful. Now, what is a growth mindset? Well, there's basically, Dweck is saying there's two different types of ways that people think about things. First is a fixed mindset, and that is, I'm only as smart as I am. I was born with as much as intelligence that I have. And if I, for example, have to do a hard math problem, I might be able to get a little bit better, but I'm going to top out at some point because I'm only as smart as I am. The other mindset is growth, which Dweck is encouraging, and that's the idea that we have malleable intelligence. In other words, yes, we all have different levels of IQ, but we can make great gains through deliberate practice over time and get better. We can grow in our abilities. This is growth mindset. Now, we might think that's obvious, but many of us have a fixed mindset. Many of us believe once we encounter adversity that there's really no reason to continue to try. They've done a number of experiments that showed that when teachers coach students in a growth mindset, they're more likely to get higher test scores or continue to try on even impossible math problems they put in front of them. Now, these ideas have roots in this idea of malleable intelligence, like I mentioned, the idea that we can get more intelligent through deliberate practice, and also our explanatory styles. Explanatory styles means how do we explain what happens to us, especially when we encounter adversity. This is often in cognitive psychology explained in an A-B-C model. A standing for adversity, B standing for belief, C standing for consequence. In other words, when I encounter adversity, what is the belief that follows and what are the consequences to that? How am I explaining this to myself? And the trick then, which cognitive psychologists ask patients to do, is to go back and say, what evidence do I have for this belief that I formed in the face of this adversity? And if we can be ones that actually explain the adversity or our failures as I'm just not there yet, rather than I'm not smart enough, we're more likely to continue on to try in our deliberate practice. So Dweck talks about getting to yet. So rather than telling ourselves or our colleagues or our children that no, they didn't get it. For example, they didn't do the chore correctly. They didn't do the work task correctly. The answer should be, you're not there yet. So this form of thinking and or praise given to others is more conducive to developing growth mindset, because we are not saying that this is an inherent flaw in the person, that they're not smart enough, they didn't get it, but rather they haven't got there yet and they need to continue. And even ourselves telling us this through our own self-talk, we must continue to practice deliberately. This requires us to focus on the process. So the process of failing over and over again and saying, we're not there yet, it's okay, I will get better, and not focus just on end goals. Sometimes when we focus just on end goals, it's a binary system. You either attained your goal or you did not. That is more akin as a feedback mechanism to this notion of fixed mindset. You either did it or you didn't do it, rather than focusing on the process and the effort. You did a lot of effort, you learned a lot of things along the way, you didn't attain your goal yet, but you will if you continue to deliberately practice and actually receive the criticism and feedback you've learned along the way of failing. There's one saying that says, fail again, fail forward. And this is certainly the idea behind growth mindset. We must embrace this idea of failure, and we must encourage it in others by saying, you're not there yet. And don't give people or our own selves self-talk of saying, well, you did a good job, when they didn't, but you're not there yet. This is how we can improve, and this is how we can continue to practice. There's also other studies that showed that if we taught students growth mindset, that their GPAs would increase. So I thought that was an interesting thing to include here. The next aspect is purpose. So we've gone through interest, we've gone through deliberate practice, which involves a lot of failure. Now we're in purpose. We must also have a sense of purpose, and this means that we're working for someone or something that's bigger than ourselves. We find meaning in the activity that we're going after. If the long-term goal we're seeking isn't purposeful and meaningful to us, we are very likely to desist, because purpose will help us hold interest, and it will help us overcome adversity as we are deliberately practicing in the realm that we're trying to increase grit. Dan Ariely is a behavioral economist, and he did an interesting study on meaning, and he set up a study where he asked participants to build Lego-type robots. These robots, he asked participants to come in and build these little robots out of Legos, and he said, I'll give you $2 to build the first, and then I'll give you $1.89 for the second, and so on and so forth, decreasing amount of money given to the participant as they built another Lego robot. And the question he had was, when would people stop? So at what point would people say it's not worth this diminishing amount of money to continue to build these Lego robots? But he decided to do two conditions. The first condition, he asked the participants to build the first Lego robot for $2, and then the next one he asked if they wanted to do it for $1.89, and so on. But he had them build the Lego robots and then put the finished product in front of them on their desk, and then he would give them a new box and they would make another one. And so by the time they were done, they had lots of Lego robots on their desk in front of them. The second condition, they would give people a Lego robot to build and then ask them if they would like to build the second one. If they said yes for $1.89, he would take apart the robot that they had just built and give it back to them and ask them to build it again. If they wanted to build a third one, he would take apart that same robot and give it back to them again to build a third robot. So in one case, the person has lots of robots on their desk, and in the second case, they're building the same robot over and over again. It's been taken apart and given back to them. Now in the meaningful condition, that means where the people were able to build these robots and put them on the desk, they built on average 10.6 robots and earned $14.40. In the non-meaningful condition, those where they were taking apart the robots in front of the participant, They only built 7.2 robots and only earned $11.5. Now, this is interesting because if you think about it, at face value, it's the exact same work. You're building Lego robots. The only difference is one's being taken apart in front of you, and the other condition, you're getting to keep your work on your desk in front of you. What this shows, and what Dan Ariely is arguing through this article, is that meaning, or the meaningful condition, was brought about because people could see the results of their labors, and it wasn't being taken away in front of them. Now, many of you may have been in a work situation where you felt like your manager or your boss was sort of disassembling the work that you are trying to do. That's very demotivating. Why? Because it's breaking down the meaning that you're trying to make. So if we want to increase our grit, we need to increase our purpose and meaning. And one way to do that is to make sure we are, number one, encouraging conditions if we are managers and leaders in an organization that allow people to see the fruits of their labors and have recognition for that. But also, we need to engender this idea of a larger purpose or cause. And we can talk about that in another webinar about how to find and gain personal purpose and organizational purpose. But how can we draw on that purpose to move people forward? And as individuals, we can look at the different deliberate practice we are doing and ask ourselves, are we setting ourselves up for failure in our deliberate practice because we don't have a growth mindset, and second, because we are not meaningful in the work we are trying to accomplish? The last aspect is hope. And so I just like to read Duckworth's quote here. She says, "So hope essentially is the belief that there's something you can do to come back from these problems or from these challenges." And I say that this is the fourth component, but it's really something that you need at varying ways all along. So hope is infused throughout the entire process of increasing grit. It's this idea that, yes, if there's failures, like we've mentioned, I can bounce back, I can make new strides, and I can continue to have hope. If we lose hope, it's hard to have meaning, it's hard to persist in deliberate practice, and we may even lose interest in our topic. So there's really these four components to building grit: interest. We got to make sure we're deliberately practicing in the area of our interest. We need to make sure we have purpose or are making meaning along the way. And last, that we remain hopeful, or we help others to achieve these things in our organizations, or if we're helping our children, for example. Now, these are our references. We will send them out with the recording, but I'm now glad to take a few questions from everyone about grit.
Thank you, Dr. Cross. As a reminder, please enter your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom. And I'd also like to invite you to join us next month for Winning Together: The Secrets of Negotiation on November 29th. First question is, do you have any additional tips how parents can encourage grit and growth mindset in their children?
So one great example that Duckworth gives is a question that parents are often faced with, which is, let's say that your son or daughter decides that they want to play the trumpet in the school band, but after about 3 months, they come to you and say, "Mom, Dad, I want to quit the trumpet. I don't want to be in the band anymore." What do you do as a parent who's trying to encourage growth mindset and grit in particular? And the answer that Duckworth gives, which I found very interesting, is that you want to balance the idea of not forcing people to continue to do what they don't want to do, but also not letting them desist before they see the results of their work. So what she should suggest to parents is that if a child chooses an activity, whether it be trumpet or soccer, that they must continue with that activity for the season or the school year. So if they chose trumpet and they wanted to be in the band, They can't quit for the entire year. If at the end of the year they decide they don't like trumpet anymore, fine, they can try something new then. Or if they started a soccer team and they are on a soccer team, then they cannot quit that activity until the season's over. But once the season is over and they might have a different interest, it's okay for them to try something else. This allows two things simultaneously. One, it allows this could be for children or for our own selves, allows us to be able to explore different interests, but also gives us a long enough commitment so that we don't let down the other people involved. And second, to find out if we are really not interested in that topic, or really not good at that topic, or really aren't deliberately practicing in that topic. And so one great strategy is this idea of you got to stick with it for a certain period of time. And after that period of time, yes, you can change. But it's a great strategy, I think, to help children and us adults increase grit.
A question from Mary. How closely related do you think grit and resiliency are?
So grit and resilience are very related. The difference, of course, is that grit is often focused on one or a few long-term goals rather than the ability to just persevere in the face of adversities that come in life. So when we often talk about resilience, we're talking about trying to measure whether or not people are hardy, whether or not they can survive through difficult things that happen in life. Yes, they might succeed in different things, but it's not particularly, in my understanding, focused on a particular long-term goal or goals.
Thank you. From Zahir, would you recommend anything in specific that students and adults could do to increase their own grit?
So I think that my opinion is that the number one sort of factor you want to consider is how do you find meaning or purpose, which was that third factor we discussed. If you can find, for example, your own personal purpose or motto, which we'll talk about in a different webinar, if you can find your own personal motto that it drives you, your own transcendent purpose, I think that that can be very motivating to move you towards long-term goals. If, for example, you find out that your purpose is to help other people learn, for example, you'll be able to more likely stick with long-term goals, find meaning in the failures, and continue on. So I think that finding personal purpose is very important to increasing grit.
From Patricia, are there any universities that are doing a good job in implementing these principles in their programs?
So certainly the University of Pennsylvania, which runs a master's in positive psychology, is at the forefront because Angela Duckworth and Martin Seligman are there to study and teach these topics, are doing really well at this. There are lots of K through 12 schools implementing aspects of grit and positive psychology into curricula. We're also noticing that here in management, leadership, and business schools like Thunderbird, that as we are redeveloping curriculum and classes, we are building in more experiential learning, which allows for a latitude of failure experiences, practical hands-on experiences that rapidly gives feedback to students and allows them to increase grit. Not only because it's in a group setting and they have to work with other people, but because it's a real world setting that allows them to get feedback through seeing what works and what doesn't. And so as we revamp our curriculum, we're adding in these experiential components and trying to take this idea of global mindset and infuse it. And I think that's helping increase flexibility of mindset and also grit.
From Mamata, how can a team member who is not in the position of leadership include grit in the team?
So if you're not in a position of leadership, it doesn't mean you can't influence others. Going back to this idea of purpose, if you can help everyone find meaning in sort of some of the meaningless tasks that are often part of our day-to-day work experiences. If you can infuse meaning in that, that's a great way to help increase grit. I think it's also interesting to help set goals. So even if you're not the leader, is there a way you can set goals for yourself that are long-term and then create smaller short-term goals that lead to those long-term goals that give feedback? And then the last thing is, as a coworker, are you giving feedback to the team members who are deliberately practicing something? So they're working on something, they're trying to increase their grit, they're trying to reach a long-term goal. Are you giving feedback that is useful to help them along the way?
From Jinjing, hi, I've seen Dr. Duckworth's TED Talk and understand the importance of grit. Any tips for developing grit and perseverance?
Yes, so I think that we mentioned those four aspects of interest, deliberate practice, purpose, and hope. And I think that the real trick is personalizing those different factors and finding, doing a self-evaluation to see where am I lacking in these areas. Do I have an interest? How strong is it? Then asking yourself, am I deliberately practicing? Have I set a schedule, for example, that will help me deliberately practice? Do I have an accountability partner or a group of people that I'm reporting to, or coaches that are helping me along the way in my deliberate practice? I think coaches are really important for deliberate practice. Think about it. In sports, it's obvious that you have a coach, but in the professions, it's not obvious that you should have a coach, but we should. Why shouldn't a surgeon, for example, a lawyer, a faculty member, a teacher, have coaches that are helping them continuously improve? We need to have coaches to better our deliberate practice. And I think that's a great aspect that we can increase grit, is by enrolling coaches and being coaches and accountability partners to others.
From Patricia, can you comment more on the meta-analysis that talks about conscientiousness being the driving factor behind grit?
So a lot of studies have been done on the big five personality traits, conscientiousness being one of those. And I can't comment particularly on the meta-analysis you're talking about because I'd have to go back and look at it. But what Duckworth is getting at is that, yes, you must be conscientious to have grit, but it's not enough because it doesn't look at this marathon approach to a long-term goal. So it's not measuring things over time towards singularities or a very small set of long-term goals that you're pursuing.
From Rocio, what would be a good way for ourselves to start assessing our own grit?
So that's a very good question. If you Google grit survey or grit instrument, there are Angela Duckworth's grit scale you can find. It's on the University of Pennsylvania Positive Psychology site, and you can take it for free and you can get your grit score and you can compare it to others, other mean or average grit scores, and see your grittiness. Thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.